How would you feel if the person responsible for your well-being, for your health, suddenly decided you weren't worth their time? Simply because of the color of your skin. It was an ordinary morning for Sarah Jenkins, who had been feeling unusually drained and fatigued over the past few weeks. Although Sarah often ignored small health issues, hoping they would resolve on their own, this time felt different. The exhaustion was overwhelming, the kind that seeped into her bones and refused to let go. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As a black woman, Sarah had always been conscious of the disparities in healthcare. She had heard too many stories of black women being dismissed or ignored by medical professionals. The fear gnawed at her, making her hesitate to seek help. But today, she couldn't ignore it any longer. With a sense of determination, she scheduled an appointment at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city, known for its top-notch medical care. That's where Dr. Peter Lawson came in. Tall, well-dressed, and exuding an air of arrogance, Dr. Lawson was a renowned physician at the hospital. He had a reputation for being one of the best, particularly among the wealthy patients who could afford his time. However, beneath his polished exterior lay a subtle bias that shaped his interactions with patients, especially those who didn't fit his preferred profile. As Sarah entered the hospital, her nerves were on edge. The hospital itself was pristine, a symbol of wealth and privilege. She passed patients in expensive clothing, doctors bustling from room to room, and nurses who barely glanced her way. The aura of exclusivity felt suffocating. Sitting in the waiting room, Sarah glanced nervously at her phone, waiting to be called. She was aware of the subtle glances from the staff, the slight hesitations in their greetings. They weren't overtly rude, but the difference in how she was treated compared to others was palpable. Still, she kept her resolve steady. All she needed was for someone to listen, to take her symptoms seriously. When her name was finally called, Sarah followed the nurse down the long, sterile corridor to the examination room. The fluorescent lights hummed above her as she sat on the edge of the examination table, waiting for Dr. Lawson to arrive. Minutes later, the door swung open, and in walked Dr. Lawson. He didn't greet her warmly. Instead, he glanced at the file in his hands, barely acknowledging her presence before sitting down at the computer. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his tone neutral, but distant. "What seems to be the problem today?" Sarah explained her symptoms, describing the exhaustion, the unrelenting fatigue, and the strange aches that seemed to linger no matter how much rest she got. She mentioned her concerns about a possible underlying condition. Dr. Lawson didn't look up from the computer screen. His fingers typed methodically, but his focus seemed far from the room. After a brief pause, he finally spoke, his voice curt and dismissive. "Well, I don't see anything immediately concerning here," he said, closing her file. "You're probably just overworked. Stress can do that." Sarah blinked in disbelief. "I've had stress before, but this feels different. I'm worried it might be something more serious." Dr. Lawson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Look, Mrs. Jenkins, I see a lot of patients every day. Most of them come in with symptoms like yours, and 9 times out of 10, it's nothing. I don't think we need to do any further tests." Sarah's heart sank. She had been expecting this, but it still stung. She had come to this hospital for help, hoping that someone would finally take her seriously. But here she was, being brushed aside yet again. "I'd really appreciate it if we could run some tests, just to be sure," Sarah insisted, her voice steady but firm. Dr. Lawson sighed, tapping his pen on the desk. "I think you're overreacting. If you're still feeling this way in a few weeks, maybe we can revisit it, but right now, I don't see the need." It was then that Sarah realized she wasn't just dealing with a dismissive doctor, she was dealing with someone who had already made up his mind about her. To him, she wasn't worth the effort. She wasn't the kind of patient he was used to treating, and that was enough for him to dismiss her concerns. Sarah stood up, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I'd like a second opinion." Dr. Lawson raised an eyebrow. "If you're looking for another doctor, be my guest," he said coldly. "But don't expect a different result." With that, Sarah walked out of the office, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe the arrogance, the audacity. How could someone so supposedly qualified be so dismissive of a patient's concerns? As she made her way to the front desk, preparing to file a complaint, Sarah reached for her phone. She needed to tell David, her husband, what had just happened. David Jenkins wasn't just a supportive partner, he was also one of the most influential healthcare executives in the region. His position gave him access to the very systems that Dr. Lawson operated in, and while Sarah rarely mentioned her husband's status, this felt like a time where his influence could make a difference. "David," Sarah said quietly into the phone, her voice trembling with frustration. "You won't believe what just happened." David Jenkins had built his career on improving healthcare access for marginalized communities. He had risen through the ranks, not because of privilege, but because of his relentless commitment to creating a fair and equitable system. He believed that everyone, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic status, deserved access to quality healthcare. And now, the very system he had worked so hard to improve was failing his wife. As soon as Sarah told him what had happened, David's mind went into overdrive. He knew Dr. Lawson's type all too well, doctors who thrived in the upper echelons of medicine, catering to the wealthy and privileged while turning a blind eye to the biases that affected their practice. This wasn't just about Sarah. This was about the countless other patients who had been dismissed, overlooked, or mistreated by people like Dr. Lawson. David's influence within the healthcare system was significant, but he wasn't one to throw his weight around unnecessarily. He believed in earning respect through action, not intimidation. But this time was different. This time, it was personal. He called the hospital's board of directors, setting up a meeting to discuss the incident. Meanwhile, Sarah filed a formal complaint against Dr. Lawson, detailing her experience and requesting that the matter be investigated. The board took the complaint seriously, knowing full well who David Jenkins was. Dr. Lawson was called into a private meeting with the board, where he was confronted with Sarah's account. At first, Dr. Lawson tried to dismiss the situation, claiming that Sarah had overreacted and that he had followed protocol. But as the board dug deeper, it became clear that this was not an isolated incident. In the weeks that followed, the hospital launched an internal investigation into Dr. Lawson's practices. Several other patients came forward with similar stories, tales of dismissal, condescension, and a lack of proper care. The evidence began to mount, and Dr. Lawson found himself facing increasing scrutiny. As the investigation unfolded, Sarah continued to advocate for change. She spoke at healthcare conferences, sharing her story and urging medical professionals to confront their own biases. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for the countless others who had been silenced. David, too, used his platform to push for reforms. He called for mandatory bias training for all medical staff, greater accountability for doctors, and a more inclusive approach to patient care. Together, they became a powerful force for change, fighting not just for justice in their own case, but for systemic change in the healthcare industry. Months later, Dr. Lawson's fate was sealed. The hospital board, recognizing the gravity of the situation, decided to terminate his employment. His reputation, once pristine, was now tarnished by his refusal to treat patients with the respect and care they deserved. But the story didn't end there. Sarah and David's fight for equity in healthcare continued. Their efforts led to significant changes within the hospital, including the implementation of new policies aimed at addressing disparities in care. The hospital became a model for others across the country, a shining example of what could happen when people stood up and demanded better. For Sarah, the journey had been painful, but it had also been empowering. She had faced discrimination head-on and had refused to back down. And in the end, her voice had made a difference, not just for herself, but for countless others who would come after her. As for Dr. Lawson, his fall from grace was swift and unrelenting. He had underestimated the power of one woman's voice, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. No longer was he the celebrated doctor with the impeccable reputation. Now, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of unchecked bias. The fight for equity isn't easy. It requires courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to justice. But in the end, it's worth it. Because when we stand up for what's right, we not only change the system, we change the world. Chapter 2, The Echo of Change. Sarah Jenkins stood by the large glass windows of her living room, watching the world outside her home slowly come to life. Cars passed by, people walked their dogs, and the faint sound of children playing in the distance could be heard. The mundane beauty of the morning calmed her as she sipped her coffee, yet her mind was elsewhere. It had been several months since the ordeal with Dr. Lawson, but the weight of that moment hadn't left her. While she and David had made significant strides in pushing for healthcare reforms, she knew that systemic change wasn't instantaneous. Their efforts had sparked something, a movement, perhaps, but the world wasn't transformed overnight. Discrimination and bias still lurked in corners of the healthcare system, and Sarah was keenly aware of that fact. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an email from the hospital's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, a group that had been formed largely because of her advocacy. The committee was planning its next event, a panel discussion on racial disparities in healthcare, and they had asked Sarah to be one of the key speakers. This wasn't the first time she had been invited to speak, but it was the first time that the hospital where her incident had occurred was hosting such a significant event. She wondered if Dr. Lawson's shadow still loomed large within those walls or if his departure had made way for true progress. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the reply button. The thought of returning to the place where she had been so deeply wronged stirred up mixed emotions. Could she walk through those doors again, knowing what had happened there? Could she face the same sterile hallways, the same indifferent faces that had greeted her before? But then Sarah remembered why she had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about Dr. Lawson anymore, it was about ensuring that no one else had to experience what she did. She took a deep breath and typed her response, "I'll be there." The day of the event, the hospital looked the same on the outside, gleaming, modern, and imposing, but Sarah knew that things had changed beneath the surface. The energy was different. As she walked through the lobby, she noticed the staff members exchanging friendly smiles, something that had been sorely missing on her last visit. Perhaps her experience had left an imprint after all. She made her way to the auditorium where the panel discussion was being held. It was a large, open space, filled with healthcare professionals, community leaders, and a few familiar faces. At the front of the room was a stage with a sleek podium and several chairs arranged for the speakers. Sarah took her seat, feeling the eyes of the audience on her as they recognized who she was. Before the panel began, the hospital's CEO, a middle-aged woman with a calm yet authoritative presence, stepped onto the stage to deliver the opening remarks. "Today's event marks a pivotal moment in our hospital's history," she began, her voice steady. "We are here to confront uncomfortable truths about the disparities that exist in healthcare and to find ways to create a system that serves everyone equally. This journey of reflection and change was inspired by the experiences of one of our patients, Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, whose courage and determination have helped guide us to this moment." The CEO gestured toward Sarah, and a wave of applause swept through the room. Sarah felt a lump in her throat as she smiled softly, nodding in acknowledgement. It wasn't the applause she sought, it was the change. The panel discussion began with an exploration of racial bias in medical treatment. Several doctors, nurses, and healthcare advocates shared stories of patients who had been ignored, misdiagnosed, or mistreated due to their race. The stories were harrowing, and yet, they were also far too common. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stood and walked to the podium, the lights of the auditorium casting a soft glow on her face. The room quieted as she took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I never imagined that my experience would become part of a larger conversation about healthcare reform," Sarah began, her voice clear and steady. "But here we are, and I'm grateful that we're having this conversation. Because for too long, stories like mine, and worse, have gone unnoticed, swept under the rug." She paused, scanning the room. "I came here to seek medical care, like any patient would. But instead, I was dismissed. I was made to feel as though my pain wasn't real, as though my concerns didn't matter. And I know I'm not alone in that experience." Sarah went on to talk about the need for more accountability in the medical field, for more empathy and understanding from healthcare providers. She spoke about the reforms that she and David had helped implement, but also about the long road ahead. "We're not there yet," she said, her tone firm but hopeful. "But we're getting closer. And it starts with each and every one of us, patients, doctors, nurses, administrators, taking a stand and demanding better." When she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause once again, but this time, it wasn't just polite recognition. It was an acknowledgement of the truth, a collective agreement that change was not only necessary, it was overdue. Later that evening after the event, Sarah found herself standing outside the hospital, gazing up at the towering building that had once been a source of frustration and pain. Now, it symbolized something else: hope. Progress. The possibility of a better future. David joined her a few minutes later, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they looked up at the building together. "You were incredible," he said softly, his voice filled with pride. Sarah smiled, leaning into him. "I hope it makes a difference." "It already has," David assured her. "You've done more than most people could ever dream of doing." Sarah sighed, her breath visible in the crisp evening air. "I just want things to change for good. For people like me, for people who don't have the resources or the voice to stand up for themselves." David nodded, his expression serious. And they will. Because of you. They stood there in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything they had accomplished settling over them. But Sarah knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the middle. This was just one step in a much larger journey, one that she and David were committed to seeing through to the end. As they walked to their car, Sarah glanced back at the hospital one last time. She knew she would be back, maybe not as a patient, but as an advocate, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. Chapter 3. The road ahead. The following weeks brought a flurry of new opportunities for Sarah and David. Healthcare organizations from across the country reached out, inviting them to speak, to consult, to help shape policies that would make hospitals more inclusive and equitable. It was exhausting work, but it was also invigorating. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, but with the success came challenges. Not everyone was eager to embrace change. There were those who resisted the idea that bias could exist in medicine, that doctors and nurses, people who had dedicated their lives to healing, could be capable of discrimination, even unconsciously. Sarah encountered pushback at every turn. Some healthcare professionals dismissed her as overreacting, insisting that the system wasn't as flawed as she claimed. Others accused her of seeking attention, of using her experience to further her own agenda, but Sarah didn't let the criticism deter her. She knew the truth, and she had the stories of countless other patients to back her up. She had become a voice for the voiceless, and she wasn't about to be silenced now. David stood by her side through it all, offering his unwavering support. Together, they attended meetings, spoke at conferences, and lobbied for legislative changes that would make healthcare more equitable for everyone. 1 year later, it had been a year since Sarah's confrontation with Dr. Lawson, and much had changed. The hospital where it all began had implemented new policies aimed at reducing bias in patient care. Mandatory bias training was now required for all staff, and patient satisfaction scores had risen dramatically as a result. But the most significant change was the creation of the Sarah Jenkins Center for Equity in Healthcare, a foundation dedicated to addressing racial disparities in medical treatment. The center was funded by donations from healthcare organizations, government grants, and private individuals who believed in the cause. Its mission was simple: to ensure that every patient, regardless of race, received the care they deserved. Sarah had become the face of the movement, but she remained humble about her role. She knew that the work was far from over, that there were still countless challenges ahead. But for the first time, she felt like real progress was being made. The day the center opened, Sarah stood before a crowd of supporters, donors, and healthcare professionals. The sun shone brightly overhead, casting a warm glow over the newly constructed building. David stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder as they prepared to cut the ribbon. "This center represents more than just a building," Sarah said, her voice steady and confident. "It represents hope. It represents change. And it represents the countless lives that will be impacted by the work we do here." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This journey has been difficult, but it's also been rewarding. And I'm proud to stand here today, knowing that together, we can make a difference." With that, she cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted into applause. As the years passed, the Sarah Jenkins Center became a beacon of hope for marginalized communities across the country. Its work led to groundbreaking research on racial disparities in healthcare, and its advocacy efforts helped shape policies at both the state and national levels. Sarah continued to speak out, to share her story, and to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And through it all, she never lost sight of the moment that had sparked it all, the day she had walked into that hospital, expecting care but receiving discrimination instead. In the end, Sarah's story wasn't just about overcoming adversity. It was about transforming that adversity into something powerful, something lasting. And in doing so, she had changed not only her own life but the lives of countless others. Chapter 4. A new generation of advocates. The Sarah Jenkins Center for Equity in Healthcare had grown beyond Sarah's wildest expectations. What began as a small organization with a single mission, ensuring equitable care for all patients, had blossomed into a nationwide movement. The center had attracted passionate advocates from all corners of the country, from medical students to experienced doctors, all committed to addressing the deep-rooted disparities in the healthcare system. As the years passed, Sarah and David gradually transitioned from being at the forefront of the movement to mentoring the next generation of leaders. Sarah watched proudly as younger voices emerged, carrying forward the cause with the same passion and determination she had once channeled into her own fight. One such leader was Dr. Maya Fields, a young black physician who had been inspired by Sarah's story years earlier. Maya had joined the center as a volunteer during her medical school days, but her relentless dedication and compassion had quickly propelled her to a leadership position. Now, as one of the center's key figures, Maya was leading groundbreaking research on the effects of implicit bias in medical diagnostics. It was at one of the center's annual fundraising events, held at a grand conference hall filled with healthcare leaders and philanthropists, that Sarah truly felt the shift in her role. She no longer needed to speak in the same way she once had. Her voice had opened doors, and now, others were walking through them. Sarah sat at a table near the stage, watching as Maya took to the podium. She remembered being in that position, young, hopeful, and determined to change the world. Maya's passion and eloquence as she spoke to the crowd were palpable. The room was silent, hanging on her every word. "Today, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us," Maya said, her voice steady and powerful. "The work we do at the center is not just about correcting the injustices of the past, it's about building a future where every patient is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. And we owe it all to pioneers like Sarah Jenkins, who had the courage to speak up when no one else would." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as the audience turned toward her, breaking into applause. She waved softly, her heart swelling with pride, not just for what she had accomplished, but for what Maya and others like her would achieve in the future. 1 year later after the event, Sarah and David spent more time focusing on their personal lives. They had given so much of themselves to the movement, but now they wanted to enjoy the quieter moments, traveling, spending time with their family, and reflecting on their journey. However, stepping back didn't mean stepping away completely. Sarah remained an active advisor for the center, attending occasional meetings and offering guidance whenever needed. She relished seeing how Maya and the other young leaders were innovating and expanding the reach of the center's work. One day, Maya approached Sarah with a proposal that both excited and unnerved her: the idea of a documentary that would tell Sarah's story, along with the broader narrative of the fight for equity in healthcare. The documentary would serve as a teaching tool, inspiring healthcare professionals across the country to confront their biases and commit to change. "I think it's time we showed people the full picture," Maya said one afternoon in Sarah's office at the center. "Your story was the catalyst, but there's so much more we need to share. This could reach people who might not otherwise understand the depth of the problem." Sarah leaned back in her chair, contemplating the idea. It wasn't that she didn't want to share her story, she had done so countless times in speeches and interviews, but putting it on film, making it permanent, felt different. It meant her personal battle would become public, in a way that was both intimate and far-reaching. After a moment of silence, she smiled softly. "Let's do it." The filming process. The documentary took months to film. It wasn't just about Sarah, it chronicled the history of racial disparities in healthcare, the systemic barriers that had long existed, and the efforts of countless individuals and organizations to tear those barriers down. The film crew followed Sarah, David, Maya, and other leaders from the center, capturing their work in real time as they fought for change. One particularly emotional day of filming took place at the very hospital where Sarah's journey had begun. It had been years since she last stepped foot in those halls, and returning felt both familiar and foreign. The hospital had changed, much like Sarah had. The old administration had been replaced by new leadership, individuals who were committed to rectifying the past and creating a more inclusive environment. The camera crew followed Sarah as she walked through the same corridor where she had once felt dismissed and overlooked. This time, however, the staff greeted her with respect and warmth, recognizing her for the trailblazer she was. Sarah stopped outside the door of the office where she had met Dr. Lawson so many years ago. The door had a different nameplate now, and the space had been converted into a room for patient consultations. It was symbolic, in a way, of how much had changed. With the camera rolling, Sarah spoke softly to the interviewer standing beside her. "This was where it all started for me," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I came here that day just wanting someone to listen, to take me seriously. And when that didn't happen, I realized how many others must have felt the same way. I never imagined that moment would lead to all of this." She gestured around her, indicating not just the hospital, but the entire movement that had grown from that single act of discrimination. "But I'm glad it did. Because now, we're making sure that no one else has to go through what I did." The documentary premiere. The documentary, titled Voices for Change, premiered at a film festival dedicated to social justice causes. Healthcare professionals, activists, and everyday citizens filled the theater, eager to see the story that had captured national attention. As the lights dimmed and the opening credits rolled, Sarah felt a surge of pride, and a little apprehension. She had watched the final cut of the film several times, but this was different. This was the world's first glimpse into her deeply personal journey. The film chronicled Sarah's experience in a raw, unfiltered way, weaving her story with that of others who had faced similar challenges. It showed moments of triumph and heartbreak, but most importantly, it highlighted the resilience of those who refused to be silenced. When the lights came back up, the audience sat in stunned silence for a few moments before breaking into a standing ovation. Sarah could feel the energy in the room, the understanding, the empathy, the drive to make things better. Maya, who had sat beside Sarah during the screening, squeezed her hand. "You did it," she whispered, tears in her eyes. Sarah smiled, tears glistening in her own eyes. "We did it." The legacy continues years after the documentary's release. Its impact continued to ripple through the healthcare system. Medical schools across the country used Voices for Change as part of their curriculum, ensuring that future doctors and nurses understood the importance of treating every patient with dignity and respect. Sarah and David had stepped into the background, but their influence remained as strong as ever. The Sarah Jenkins Center had become a national leader in healthcare reform, and its mission had expanded to address disparities not just in race, but in gender, income, and access to care. Maya had taken over as the center's executive director, leading with the same passion and drive that had once inspired her to join the movement. Under her leadership, the center continued to grow, forming partnerships with hospitals, universities, and governments to create a more equitable healthcare system for all. Sarah, now in her later years, often reflected on how far they had come. Sitting on the porch of her home, with David by her side, she marveled at the progress they had made together. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" David asked one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. "Every day," Sarah replied, her voice soft with nostalgia. "It started with a single voice. And now, it's a chorus." David smiled, taking her hand in his. "You've changed the world, Sarah." "We changed it," she corrected, resting her head on his shoulder. As they sat there in the fading light, Sarah knew that their work had made a difference. They had sparked a movement that would continue long after they were gone, ensuring that future generations would inherit a healthcare system that treated everyone with fairness and respect. And in that knowledge, Sarah found peace. Because she knew that the fight for equity was never just about one person. It was about all of them, those who had been silenced, those who had spoken out, and those who would carry the torch forward. Chapter 5, The Unfinished Fight. It was early morning when Sarah Jenkins woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of fresh earth, signaling that autumn had truly settled in. She stretched her arms and let out a quiet yawn, feeling the familiar weight of age in her bones. Though the work at the Sarah Jenkins Center had kept her busy over the years, these days she found herself enjoying the quieter moments of life more often. David had already been awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his tablet, reading through the morning news. He looked up and smiled as Sarah walked in, his eyes warm and familiar. They had grown older together, but their bond remained as strong as it had always been, if not stronger. "Morning," David said, sliding a cup of tea across the table. "Morning," Sarah replied, sitting down beside him. They didn't need to speak much. Their mornings were often spent in comfortable silence, punctuated by the occasional soft laugh or comment about the day ahead. But today, something weighed on Sarah's mind. The center had been doing exceptionally well under Maya's leadership. It had expanded into new areas, tackling health disparities related to income, access to insurance, and even issues related to mental health, areas that Sarah had always dreamed of addressing. Maya had brought new energy to the movement, and Sarah admired her deeply for it, but despite all the progress, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The inequities in healthcare, while reduced, were still present. Stories of mistreatment, of patients being dismissed or misdiagnosed because of their race or gender, continued to emerge. Every new report made Sarah wonder if they had done enough. As she sipped her tea, Sarah glanced over at David. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked softly. David looked at her, knowing exactly what she was referring to. "It's never enough," he said gently. "But we've made more progress than I ever thought possible. And the work is still going on." "I know," Sarah sighed, setting her cup down. "But it feels like there's always more to do. Sometimes I wonder if we're just scratching the surface." David nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had spent years working alongside her, pushing for reforms, fighting for accountability, and navigating the bureaucracy of healthcare. He knew how draining it could be. There's always more to do, he said after a pause. But that's why we've passed the torch. It's Maya's time now. And she's more than capable. Sarah smiled, though the concern still lingered in her eyes. I know. But I can't help feeling like there's something we're missing. Something that needs to be addressed before it's too late. David leaned back in his chair, studying her face. What is it? I'm not sure, Sarah admitted. But I think I need to go back. To the center. I've been distant for too long. David reached out and squeezed her hand. Then go. You've never been one to sit still when something's on your mind. Sarah smiled again, feeling the familiar spark of determination reignite within her. She had stepped back to give Maya room to lead, but that didn't mean her role in the movement was finished. There were still battles to fight, and Sarah wasn't ready to let go just yet. A return to the center. The Sarah Jenkins Center had grown in both size and scope since its founding. What had once been a modest building with a small staff had transformed into a bustling hub of research, advocacy, and policy development. The building was now equipped with state-of-the-art labs, conference rooms filled with experts in healthcare equity, and a growing team of professionals dedicated to dismantling systemic barriers in medicine. When Sarah walked through the doors, she was greeted with familiar smiles and warm welcomes. Though she hadn't been as involved in the day-to-day operations recently, her presence was still felt throughout the organization. Her name was on the walls, her story embedded in the very mission of the center. Maya was in her office when Sarah arrived, reviewing data from a recent study on racial disparities in maternal healthcare. The young woman's brow was furrowed in concentration, her pen tapping absently on the desk as she pored over the numbers. Busy day? Sarah asked from the doorway, a gentle smile on her face. Maya looked up, surprised but delighted to see her mentor. Sarah. What a pleasant surprise. They embraced, and Maya motioned for Sarah to sit down. I didn't expect to see you here today. How are you? I'm well, Sarah said, taking a seat across from Maya's desk. But I've been thinking a lot lately. About the work we're doing here, about the future. Maya nodded, her expression attentive. Go on. I've been so proud of everything you've done, Maya, Sarah continued. The center has grown in ways I never could have imagined. But I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something. That there are gaps we haven't filled yet. Maya leaned forward, her interest piqued. What do you mean? Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. We've done incredible work addressing racial disparities, income-based inequalities, and access issues. But I think there's an area we haven't fully explored yet: aging. How healthcare treats elderly patients, especially those who come from marginalized communities. Maya sat back in her chair, thoughtful. You're right. That's an area we haven't focused on much yet. But the aging population is growing, and they face unique challenges in the healthcare system. Sarah nodded. Exactly. I've been thinking about it more as I've gotten older. How often are elderly patients, especially Black or Latino seniors, dismissed? How often are their symptoms written off as just part of aging, when in reality they're being overlooked because of their race or background? Maya tapped her pen on the desk again, her mind already racing with ideas. This is a huge issue. We've seen data on it before, but we haven't devoted enough resources to addressing it. I think it's time we did, Sarah said, her voice firm. There's a whole generation of people who are being left behind. We need to make sure they're part of this movement, too. Maya smiled, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I agree. Let's start working on this right away. A new initiative. The Sarah Jenkins Center launched its new initiative within weeks, Aging with Dignity, a program aimed at addressing healthcare disparities faced by elderly patients, particularly those from underserved communities. The program sought to conduct comprehensive research, advocate for policy changes, and provide education for healthcare providers on the unique needs of aging patients of color. Sarah was at the forefront once again, working closely with Maya and the rest of the team to shape the direction of the program. She spent long hours reviewing data, meeting with experts, and speaking at conferences to raise awareness about the issue. Her passion for the cause was renewed, and she felt more energized than she had in years. The work wasn't easy. There were still countless obstacles to overcome, entrenched biases in the medical field, lack of funding for elderly care programs, and the ever-present challenge of changing public perception. But Sarah thrived in the face of adversity. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to stop now. The impact within the first year, the Aging with Dignity initiative had made significant strides. The center published a groundbreaking study on the treatment of elderly patients in hospitals, revealing stark disparities in the way Black, Latino, and Indigenous seniors were diagnosed and treated compared to their white counterparts. The findings shocked the medical community and prompted calls for immediate action. Hospitals across the country began implementing new protocols for treating elderly patients, focusing on individualized care and cultural competency. Medical schools added courses on aging and healthcare equity to their curriculums, ensuring that future doctors would be better equipped to care for a diverse aging population. Sarah and Maya traveled to Washington, D.C., to meet with lawmakers and advocate for policies that would increase funding for elderly care programs and ensure that aging patients from all backgrounds received the care they deserved. Their efforts paid off when a bill was introduced to Congress aimed at addressing healthcare disparities in elder care. A legacy cemented as the years went by. Sarah watched with pride as the Aging with Dignity initiative grew and evolved. The Sarah Jenkins Center had become a beacon of hope for elderly patients who had long been overlooked and marginalized by the healthcare system. Sarah's name had become synonymous with healthcare equity, not just for women of color, but for all who had been excluded from quality care. By the time Sarah reached her mid-70s, the center had expanded its reach even further, establishing satellite offices in cities across the country. The movement had become a national force, with Sarah's story at its heart. But for Sarah, the greatest reward wasn't in the accolades or the recognition. It was in knowing that the work would continue long after she was gone. She had dedicated her life to fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and now, that fight would carry on through the people she had mentored, the policies she had helped shape, and the countless lives she had touched. As Sarah sat in her office one evening, looking out over the city skyline, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had made a difference, and that was all she had ever wanted. Epilogue: a future built on hope. Years after Sarah Jenkins passed, her legacy continued to flourish, leaving an indelible mark on the healthcare landscape. The Sarah Jenkins Center for Equity in Healthcare had become a powerhouse, not just in the United States but globally, recognized for its tireless work in dismantling systemic barriers in healthcare. The Aging with Dignity initiative had sparked a nationwide movement, influencing how elderly patients, especially from marginalized communities, were treated in medical settings. Chapter 6: The Weight of a Legacy. Maya Fields stood before a large crowd gathered at the annual Sarah Jenkins Memorial Gala, held in honor of Sarah's birthday. The room was filled with healthcare professionals, activists, and supporters of the center's mission. Maya, now in her early 40s, had assumed leadership of the center after Sarah's passing, and she had continued the work with the same fire and determination that Sarah had inspired in her all those years ago. The gala was an emotional event, celebrating the legacy of a woman who had fought so hard for justice in a system that often resisted change. Large portraits of Sarah hung throughout the venue, her warm, confident smile a reminder of the battles she had won. Maya approached the podium, clearing her throat before beginning her speech. "We are here today not just to remember Sarah Jenkins, but to carry forward the legacy she built with her blood, sweat, and tears. She wasn't just an advocate. She was a force of nature, and because of her, millions of people who would have otherwise been invisible to the system, were seen, heard, and treated with the dignity they deserved." Maya paused, scanning the faces of the attendees, all of whom had been touched by Sarah's work in some way. "But let's not forget that the fight isn't over. Sarah left us with a mission, and it's one we can't abandon. Healthcare equity is not just a goal, it's a right. And it's up to us to continue this fight, to ensure that no patient is ever dismissed, ignored, or neglected because of the color of their skin, their age, their gender, or their income." As the crowd applauded, Maya felt the weight of the mantle she now carried. Sarah's shoes were impossible to fill, but Maya knew that wasn't the point. She wasn't here to replace Sarah, she was here to honor her work by pushing it forward, evolving it for the future. A new challenge. The next day, Maya sat in her office at the center, reviewing a troubling report. It detailed the challenges the healthcare system was now facing as technology advanced at an unprecedented pace. Artificial intelligence and algorithms were increasingly being used to make diagnostic decisions, but the data behind those algorithms was biased, trained on predominantly white, upper-class populations. This meant that once again, marginalized communities, particularly Black, Latino, and Indigenous patients, were being left behind, misdiagnosed, or outright ignored by a system that claimed to be advanced but was fundamentally flawed. Maya stared at the report, her mind racing. The implications were staggering. These algorithms, designed to make healthcare more efficient, were instead perpetuating the same disparities Sarah had fought so hard to eradicate. And worse, because the decisions were being made by machines, there was less accountability. We can't let this happen, Maya muttered to herself. She knew this was the next frontier in the fight for healthcare equity. As medical technology advanced, so too did the risk of systemic bias being codified into the very algorithms meant to save lives. Maya called a meeting with the center's board, determined to tackle the issue head-on. The algorithmic fight over the next few months, the center launched a new initiative, Equity in the Age of AI, dedicated to ensuring that artificial intelligence and machine learning systems in healthcare were built with fairness and inclusivity at their core. The initiative sought to gather diverse data sets, bringing in experts from communities that had historically been underrepresented in medical research. Maya, now an expert in both healthcare policy and technology, led the charge. She spent countless hours meeting with tech companies, lobbying policymakers, and raising awareness about the dangers of biased algorithms in healthcare. Her work was groundbreaking, but it was also met with resistance from those who didn't want to admit that their shiny new technologies were flawed. One particularly tense meeting took place in Silicon Valley, where Maya sat across from the CEO of one of the largest tech companies developing AI for medical diagnostics. The room was sleek, filled with the latest gadgets and innovations, a stark contrast to the real-world consequences these technologies could have. The CEO, a confident man in his 50s, smiled across the table. We're making healthcare more efficient. Our AI systems are cutting down diagnostic times by 50%. Think of all the lives we're saving. Maya didn't flinch. I'm not arguing that AI can't improve healthcare. But your system is flawed. It's not built for everyone, just for the people who look like you. What happens when a Black woman or a Latino elder comes into a hospital, and your AI doesn't recognize their symptoms because they weren't included in your datasets? The CEO's smile faltered. We're working on that. These things take time. Time. Maya said, her voice rising with frustration. People are dying. Misdiagnosed because your technology sees them as outliers. Sarah Jenkins didn't fight for a world where Black and brown bodies were still seen as anomalies. She fought for a world where we were all seen as equals. The CEO shifted in his seat, uncomfortable but clearly understanding the gravity of her words. Here's the reality, Maya continued. If you don't fix this, if you don't include diverse data sets and make sure your AI is capable of diagnosing all patients, not just some, I will make it my mission to stop you. And trust me, the Sarah Jenkins Center is a lot more powerful than you think. The CEO was silent for a long moment before finally nodding. We'll look into it. Maya left the meeting feeling a sense of victory but knowing that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The new era as the Equity in the Age of AI initiative gained traction, hospitals and tech companies began to reevaluate their systems. The center became a leading voice in the conversation about technology in healthcare, ensuring that the future of medicine was one that served everyone. The initiative's success was a testament to the legacy Sarah had left behind. While Sarah had fought against human biases, Maya was now tackling the biases embedded in machines. It was a new era, but the principles remained the same: justice, fairness, and the belief that every person, no matter their background, deserved quality care. The center's work on AI extended beyond healthcare diagnostics. It also addressed the use of AI in predicting patient outcomes, determining treatment plans, and even in mental health services. By ensuring that these systems were built with diverse and inclusive data, the center was laying the groundwork for a more equitable future in healthcare technology. That a new generation rises. Maya's work continued for years, and as she grew older, she began to think about what Sarah had once told her, that the torch must always be passed. Maya had learned from the best, and now it was time for her to mentor the next generation of leaders. One of those emerging leaders was a young doctor named Kiana Rivers, a brilliant woman who had recently completed her residency and had been inspired by the work of both Sarah and Maya. Kiana was particularly interested in combining her love of medicine with technology, working to ensure that the AI systems being used in healthcare were ethical and fair. Maya saw a lot of herself in Kiana, her passion, her determination, and her unwillingness to accept injustice. As they worked together, Maya knew that Kiana would be the one to take the center into the next phase of its journey. Kiana, Maya said one afternoon, after a long day of meetings, I want you to lead the next expansion of the center. I want you to take this fight to the next level. Kiana looked at her, wide-eyed. Me? But you're still here. You're the leader. Maya smiled. That's what Sarah said to me once. But the truth is, leadership isn't about holding on to power. It's about knowing when to pass it on. Kiana nodded, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Maya said softly. You've got this. A legacy beyond the center. Years after Maya passed the torch to Kiana, the Sarah Jenkins Center for Equity in Healthcare continued to thrive, constantly evolving to meet the challenges of the modern world. Its work on AI had expanded globally, and its initiatives had inspired countless other organizations to take up the cause of healthcare equity. But the greatest testament to Sarah's legacy wasn't the size of the center or the scope of its projects, it was the countless lives that had been touched, the patients who had finally received the care they deserved, the doctors who had learned to treat all people with empathy and respect. Sarah Jenkins had left behind more than a legacy. She had built a movement, one that would continue to shape the future of healthcare for generations to come, and that, in the end, was all she had ever wanted.